Hello, good afternoon. Thank you very much for those watching us. It's a great pleasure to be here today, sharing this great panel on high level to discuss migration, forced displacement, and climate adaptation. Each of us here today know too well the alarming science behind the pressing need to drastically reduce greenhouse gas emissions and significantly increase climate adaptation. The United Nations called the latest report by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change a red alert for humanity. The devastating floods, the wildfires, and the heat waves that hit different regions of the world in 2021 brought this home to us in a tragic way for many of us, let me say. Over the past 2 weeks, leaders have gathered in Glasgow to address these challenges. But even in a world with 1.5 degrees warming, climate change poses far reaching and devastating impacts on people in many of the most vulnerable regions of the world. The links between the climate change and human mobility are increasingly visible. Migration and forced displacement are the very human face of climate change. A greater frequency and intensity of climate events contribute to forced displacement. They are shaping the patterns of the movement of people. In the long term, climate change will become the most important driver of migrations and forced displacement. People will migrate due to slow onset climate change impacts like drinkable water scarcity, lower crop productivity, and the sea level rise. Some places will simply become non-viable and non-livable due to heat stress, due to extreme events, and due to land drowning. Most will migrate within their countries, whilst many others will be trapped in the face of climate-related changes. The poorest households being disproportionately affected by migration pressures and by barriers to movement. We are here today to explore how we can together, as the international community, support a long-term transition to migration patterns that are humane, that are safe, that are legal, and that are based on enhanced choices, and prevent migration or forced displacement that is based on economic destitution, on inequality, insecurity, and threats such as conflict and climate change. I'm delighted to be here today, joined by a panel of top-level speakers. They will help us to explore the role that we can all play and how climate adaptation can prevent forced displacement and support us to adapt and prepare for changes in the patterns of movements of people. This is paramount to ensure that no one is left behind, that no one is trapped and with no mobility choices, that no one is forced to leave their homes with nowhere to go and little alternative sources of livelihoods. So let me begin by introducing Hanne Beirens, Director of the Migration Policy Institute for Europe. Migration Policy Institute is a key partner of the EIB in developing evidence-based approaches to working in the areas of migration and forced displacement. Migration Policy Institute accompanied us on our journey and played a critical role in shaping our work. I'm also delighted to be joined by Caroline Dumas, Special Envoy on Migration and Climate for the International Organization for Migrations. The International Organization for Migrations has an extensive experience and expertise that is instrumental to all of us. We are particularly keen to further deepen the complementarity between international actors to best tackle the challenges that we face. I'm pleased to share with you that EIB and IOM will sign later on today an MOU to deepen our collaboration. It is also great pleasure to welcome the InterAmerican Development Bank. The InterAmerican Development Bank currently holds the chairmanship of the MDB platform on economic migration and forced displacement. It's a key forum for multilateral development banks to learn from and collaborate through, seeking to achieve greater and developmental impact. It is represented today here by Graham Watkins, Chief of the Climate Change and Sustainability Division. Finally, let me introduce Runa, founder and executive director of Friendship, an international social purpose organization that works in remote areas of northern Bangladesh, on the shifting river islands of the Brahmaputra and Jamuna rivers. Char dwellers are regularly forced to migrate to new homes due to natural disasters, and Runa will share with us this in very first hand this experience. So let me thank all of you for joining us, and let me address my first question to Caroline Dumas. Caroline, the IOM played an instrumental role in the UNFCCC when the 2015 Paris Agreement was adopted at COP21. Climate migrants were for the first time formally rendered visible within the wider international policy arena. Can you set the scene for us and tell us what the IOM is picking up on in terms of changing the mobility trends as a result of climate change? Where might we see increasing strains on host communities? Where the most vulnerable people might be increasingly trapped? What opportunities do you believe migration, if well managed, might offer in terms of adapting to climate change?
Thank you, Vice President, and good afternoon to all. Well, yes, you're right. I mean, the first evident actually reference to migrants linked to climate change was actually in Cancun, but then the notion was more entrenched actually in the Agreement of Paris. Since 2015 and the Agreement of Paris, we've seen that notion of loss and damage. I mean, the main destruction suffered by populations which had to suffer big damages from climate, disasters, hazards. We've seen that notion entrenched in several working instruments and frameworks. So Paris instituted the VIM, which is the Warsaw Mechanism, and then a specific task force to watch about, displacement, task force for displacement, which gave way now to a rather state initiative of the platform for displacement, disaster displacement. On its side, IOM is still extremely, cautious in watching that notion of human mobility being more entrenched in international frameworks, international instruments. Loss and damage is one side of it, a very important, of course, aspect of it. But we do have to take in account now that, for instance, in 2020 only, out of 40 million internally displaced persons in the world, more than 98% of them were displaced for climate hazard reality and risks or events. So these 30 million people that we are going to have 1 year after the other are going, of course, to be a very and then a more and more serious problem. Given the World Bank estimates and the second groundswell report, if we do not reach, and if the international community does not keep to the 1.5 target and does not, do all its mitigation work, we could see more than 200 million people displaced by 2050. It's now a worldwide problem that has to be addressed at national level, but as well regional and international level. So I might come back maybe, and I want to leave the floor, of course, might come back on what IOM is doing more specifically on these, facing this problem.
Thank you very much, Caroline, for just outlining the global trends and the hotspots and the trajectory climate change is taking us on with regards to human mobility, be it forced displacement risks or migration. And we know that climate change and conflict are mutually reinforcing, and therefore policy responses require integrated approaches from all of us. Let me turn to Anne. Anne, can you tell us about European policy response to the pressures posed by climate change and changing patterns of mobility? How do you see the European Union actors and countries seeking to address the upcoming challenges or harnessing opportunities where these exist?
Thank you very much, Vice President, for this question. It's clear that the EU still has a long way to go on this. On the one hand, both topics, so climate change and migration, are very high on the European political agenda. They've been catapulted there for a number of reasons, but the connection of those two policy themes remain weak in the EU policy space. So if we have a look at the big strategy documents in both domains, we see that on the one hand, the European Green Deal recognizes that climate change constitutes a source of instability, and also the new pact on migration and asylum that was launched in September of last year also mentions that climate change is a root cause of migration. And as Caroline explained, there's a general consensus also in the Brussels bubble that climate change will affect mobility, migration, and forced displacement. However, so far we have seen very limited efforts to come up with a clear European strategy and action plan to address some of the challenges at the crossroads of these two policy areas. For example, a recent report launched by the Commission on Migration barely references climate change. And so the question is, who needs to take this on? Because also this kind of limited policy attention is mirrored at the institutional level. So for example, DG Home, which is the equivalent of the Ministry of Interior of the EU, there isn't a team that works on migration and climate change. There's also presently no fora or platforms that bring these different policymakers together. And so the result of that is that policymakers, practitioners, program designers do not know their counterpart on the other side. They do not know who to turn to discuss some of these interlinkages. And that's not typical for the EU governance level. Also at the national level, we see this. And so what is interesting is that at the local level, we see more efforts to talk to one another. And for example, we see that yesterday here also at the COP, there was the launch of the Global Mayors Action Agenda on Climate and Migration. And maybe it's not too surprised that they are the ones actually bringing those different fields together, because they're often at the forefront of dealing with some of the negative effects of climate change and reception of new migrants and refugees. And so that's really a big project now, a 1 million pilot initiative that will really try to address some of these actions, for example, better manage flows from rural to urban areas and help to pave the way to a green transition. But we have to maybe end by saying that there is some effort so far to really bridge this gap. And this is particularly in relation to the development side. So development actors have really become more active in this field, and you can discern 3 big approaches that have been deployed to date when working in low and middle income countries. So first of all, there's just a recognition that there are local populations that live in climate vulnerable areas, and what kind of action can we take to enhance their resilience? So really helping them to adapt. So for example, diversifying the forms of livelihood opportunities, generating alternative forms of livelihoods, building infrastructure that's resilient to climate related events and slow onset changes, so that you really lower the pressure to migrate and avoid displacement in the future. So think about, for example, working together, as we've seen with the EU Emergency Trust Fund in Africa, with pastoral and agro-pastoral communities to, for example, introduce new techniques for animal husbandry. A second strategy is very much saying, well, we recognize that migration has been in the past used by communities to diversify their income. Think about seasonal work, think about family members moving to another city or region to temporarily take up a job and send income back to the family. So here it's very much leveraging mobility as an adaptation strategy and recognizing that if it's well planned and managed, that migration can actually reduce populations' exposure to climate-reduced natural disasters. And so that's a really important one. And so just to end, the third strategy is efforts to really mitigate the negative impact that migration and forced displacement can have on the environment. So here it's also, for example, EU initiatives that recognize and mitigate the effects or the negative effects that refugee presence has in regions that are already affected by climate change, in Kenya, Ethiopia, in Uganda. And so there the objectives of the interventions is to protect and even restore the environment. And our partners from the EIB and EIB can actually tell us a bit more about that. And just to conclude on an optimistic note, we're now at the start of a new budget cycle in the EU. We have agreements on the funding in the next 7 years. And so we have this new fund called Global Europe, where there are specific targets for climate change. 30% of the money is supposed to be directed to that and 10% to migration. So this is a real opportunity to, on one hand, experiment, keep track of what's happening and to what effect, but also really see whether we can actually design programs that bring the interests and the needs of those two fields together. And I'll end with that. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Hanne, for your perspective. At EIB, we are pretty much committed to use NDC Global Europe the best way, in particular tackling also and addressing the issue of migration. Let me now turn to Graham and to the InterAmerican Development Bank. So the InterAmerican Development Bank has been at the forefront of considering what operational responses are needed to help support Central and South American countries to cope with the climate change and manage the migration patterns. The continent has a long story of migration alongside recent experiences of significant and pressing migration flows in Venezuela, in Honduras, and in other parts of the Central and South America. Graham, can you walk us through how you are tackling climate and migration in a holistic manner? And what does it mean for InterAmerican Development Bank from an operational perspective?
Thank you, Ricardo, and thanks to the EIB and to all of the other panelists and to everyone who's listening. Thanks for the opportunity. I'm going to try and answer that question, but I also want to emphasize what Hanne said is that, this is rapidly evolving, it's growing, and we have a long way to go. We're not there by any means yet. And as you say, Ricardo, the Latin American and Caribbean context is extraordinary with respect to both migration and climate. The region is highly vulnerable to climate change, to extreme weather-related events, to slow onset effects. What we're seeing is increasing frequency and increasing costs of the larger events, particularly in the Caribbean and in Central America, that are really having a huge impact on those countries and on the people, obviously, in those countries. We've got recurrent floods, droughts, hurricanes, and I don't want to continue the list, rising sea levels, which are all threatening things like agricultural productivity, food security, water availability, directly impacting infrastructure that's not resilient to those kinds of things, productive capital, and obviously employment and livelihoods directly. And ultimately is also affecting fiscal stability. And I think we need to be aware of that there are sovereign risks to all of these kinds of damages that are occurring. And we know that we have to put in place adaptation measures. We already have to put in place adaptation measures. Their estimates are there are about 17 million people in LAC have been displaced already between 2008, 2019. I mean, I think Carolyn's global numbers emphasize the issue. The issue is already with us and it's a substantive issue. There are estimated risks that we may be seeing movements of 1.2 million people a year as we move forward, but that doesn't necessarily take into account increasing frequency and intensity of the impacts. Looking forward, you may be looking at another 17 million before 2050 that are going to be moving internally. But internal displacement is only the start of this. I mean, if you get a 10% decline in agricultural productivity in Mexico, you're going to get an estimated 2% increase in the Mexico-US border migration problem. If you get worsened climate scenarios in Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, you probably could be looking at 4.5 million people moving from that region to the United States. So it's going to drive also external migration. So clearly this is a huge challenge. There's no doubt about it. We need to work very closely internally between the climate and migration group and really try to address this as part of the sustainable development approach of the bank and how it's trying to help countries. And in that sense, we have sort of two approaches, very sort of similar to what Hanne was describing, that first is really to improve resilience and adaptive capacity in the communities and make sure that communities that are already impacted and receiving impacts, they can increase their resilience and their capacity to respond to those impacts. And the second is, how do you work with the host communities? So where people are moving to, which could be urban areas, but also different countries. How do you actually help them address the challenges of climate as well? Our belief is that one step in that direction is really to make sure you have very strong social protection programs. Those are the keys for making sure you have resiliency and household adaptation to climate change. I wanted to run quickly, I don't want to take up too much time, through sort of 3 examples in terms of operationalizing this, which we're only now beginning to really pilot and move forward. We've used things like unconditional cash transfers as a way of supplementing income and to protect or help protect households and adapt to shocks in the future as well. Cash transfer programs can also be used to support climate adaptation if they're conditional. So if you add conditionality to a cash transfer program that's linked to things like performance of environmental services or public works or support to public works, you can actually target the efforts of cash transfers so that they're actually also increasing adaptive capacity in communities. So you can do things like with these targeted conditional transfers, you can help improve levels of food security in the short term. You can condition the transfers on the basis of restoration of ecosystems, on maintaining ecosystems or creating environmental service assets and things like that. So that's one area that we're looking at. And as an example, we just approved a grant in Haiti, which tries to operationalize some of these things. It has the unconditional cash transfers, which hopefully will protect communities as they have done in the past. But it also is piloting this idea of the cash transfers that are conditional on participation in small works programs or in support to protecting environmental assets. We're exploring this also with respect to mangroves and other kinds of ecosystems that can actually protect against the damages that are coming. So this program really helps vulnerable communities in the context of fragile ecosystems to both recover from the shock, but then also to be able to strengthen for the next shock as well. That's one example. And another one is to try and make the social protection systems, generic social protection systems, actually responsive and directly responsive to the climate shocks. These are things like shock responsive cash transfer mechanisms that basically, on the aftermath of a crisis, they automatically scale up. So they also automatically increase to help the communities and try and protect the communities. We're working on in some countries really trying to strengthen their existing social protection systems to allow them to gather additional data at a household level, to look at climate vulnerabilities in much more detail, to be able to map disasters and when disasters are likely to happen, so that you have an ex-ante way of identifying who you can target the benefits to directly in the case that you actually have a climate shock. And we're also looking at how you might incorporate electronic payments into this kinds of systems so that if somebody has been forced to move, they can still access the additional protection that's afforded by that as a result of a climate event. And as a final example on this, and this I think comes back to something I think Hanne mentioned as well, is that we also need to make sure that communities actually have the skills to adapt to climate change as a result of the transition to a low carbon economy. We are going to see job losses. If the transition continues in the direction it's going, you are going to see job losses. You can already see some of this happening. I mean, there's a lot of discussion at COP around the removal of coal and fossil fuels. Well, there are communities that depend on coal and fossil fuels and have done for hundreds of years. So the question is, what happens in those communities? How do you manage the impacts on those communities? And how do you reskill those communities so that they can take advantage of the potential future opportunities? We really need to strengthen all of our efforts to actually predict what are going to be the shifts and actually begin working with countries so that countries can set up the policy frameworks that allow people to track those changes and take advantage of those opportunities. We're looking at this in several countries, and we're looking at policy loans to begin with to try and move the policy objective around so that you can improve the support to green sectors, to green skills development, and also in doing that, make sure that you're focusing very strongly on vulnerable populations, particularly vulnerable populations. So those are some ideas of the kinds of things that we're looking at. I repeat, there is still a very long way to go. This is a relatively recent discussion. It shouldn't have been, but we're now trying to drive this into the core of our response to how we're going to deliver sustainable development through our Vision 2025. But this is where we're going.
Well, thank you very much, Graham. Very clear, and thanks for touching on the just transition aspect, which in my view is a very, very key aspect. And as you mentioned, and rightly so, if we go in the direction we're going, which is the right one, we'll see the largest transfer of wealth across the globe that we ever witnessed in our lives, with the countries that have their economies based on fossil fuels, and that out of a sudden will have something that turns from an asset into a liability. And we need to help definitely these communities. Otherwise, they will resist, and we are creating the poverty of the future, which is not at all what we are aiming by having a transition that needs to be just, without the winners and losers, but with the whole population, the whole citizens of the world, whole humankind gaining. So pretty much, I think we need to push more in this direction. Fully agree with you. Caroline, let me turn to you. The International Organization for Migration is supporting important research globally. And we know that in many parts of the world, extreme weather has caused widespread hunger, displacement, and loss of critical infrastructures and livelihoods. Can you tell us where you see the scope for the concerned countries, their neighbors, and the international community to prevent such future crises and displacements? How can we support the communities and countries to adapt to climate change? I know that IOM's work in the field is learning for all of us in terms of how practically strengthen the population adaptation capacities and resilience. Can you share some experience, some of this experience with us?
Thank you. Yes. You know, let me come back precisely to the impact, the very serious impact of climate change on the populations which are moving, but those sometimes which try not to move. I mean, you have an impact on the communities, which has been said, on the livelihoods, on their lives on everyday basis, on their health, on the socio-economic link inside the communities or among communities, and even driving to instability consequences. If you talk to pastoralists or to, let's say, African governments, they will mention the pastoralists in Western Africa, for instance, where tensions are much higher than a few years ago, because if there was kind of normal seasonal migration for looking for more water, or for having the cattle, I mean, better places for the cattle, you have now an increased necessity of moving, and of moving for longer periods, which does create conflict among communities. So what maybe IOM would like to stress first, and what we can do, the international community, IOM is focusing precisely on the needs of the migrants, but of the affected communities as well. So our aim is to keep the people, if I can say, safe, healthy, and resilient, as it was said, to help them prepare to the next event. We have two pillars of action. One pillar is maybe the best known one, which is the pillar of the humanitarian response, with other actors on the international scene, obviously. But the response for those who have been hit by disaster, who have to move, and on that basis we are mostly on reconstruction and projects, concrete projects of reconstruction, rebuilding, relocation, that we are doing with partners like UNHCR or UNDP or local NGOs, local partners, and non-state actors. What now we try to do, and we try to push the international community to take as well in account, is to work more on that, or at least as much on that second pillar, which is the segment ahead of the disaster, if I can say, which is more a development, what we would call a development, if I can say, segment, which is the adaptation that our two friends mentioned before me. We feel that given the rise in intensity and frequency of climate hazards, we have to help communities all over the world to try to adapt. And moving is already an adaptation at one point, provided it is safe and regular and well handled. When we can avoid it, most populations want to stay in their houses, in their livelihoods, in their communities. And when we know, we do have the data, I'm going to come to it, we do have now the latest IPCC report, we have much data indicating that the intensity of the events is going to increase, the number of events is going to increase, their regularity. So we do have to try to prepare populations to resist as much as they can. This is in that aim and goal, which is the one of the Task Force for Displacement, which is averting and minimizing the risks and minimizing the loss and damage. So adaptation projects, for instance, are both on preparedness and disaster risk reduction. And this is both on the level, on the political, if I can say, level of advocacy, and on the capacity building, working with local authorities, national authorities, or regional authorities. Helping them cope with the new disaster coming, helping them prepare their contingency planning, helping them prepare maybe an evacuation or relocation of the populations. Then we have more concrete projects, which are projects on the grounds, like what we call wonderful walls. Building small engineering projects, which are small technical development projects against floods, for instance, or of reforestation in West Africa, floods in Southeast Asia. Now, the InterAmerican Bank does know it even much better than I do. Some islands in Central America are telling you we reach as well the limits of adaptation, because in their case, their islands are just drowning slowly, and they have to envisage something which goes much beyond adaptation, and which is going to happen as relocation. So we feel that the international community now has really, beyond, the action, which is an important, of course, and crucial action on mitigation, focusing on the 1.5, keeping the target. The international community has to put the human beings at the center of climate policies. And this has to be declined at the, again, local or national, regional, international level. Then we have to focus more, again, with our partners, either developing partners, developing banks, but authorities, political authorities, to focus on the most vulnerable countries, but as well people. This is a question of, again, building resilience, helping these people keep safe. It's a question of security, keep healthy. There is a big issue in the question of health, and we've seen it, of course, during that last year of the pandemic, migrants are more fragile than others. They are more vulnerable than other populations, even when the other populations are hit by climate change. So we would like to at least, to put the human being at the center now of policies, governmental policies, but as well development policies. It's a question, not only a question of humanitarian action, but development policy. We do have work in the Pacific, for instance, on data and research. We have an initiative, a specific initiative on focusing mainly on sharing data research with different partners. We have other initiatives with small banks, for instance, for leveraging initiatives and specific facilities, if I can say, to help local banks to work with with the displaced persons and use the remittances of those who have left. And then there are these projects I talked about, which are more on the development aspect. But again, a lot can be done at the international level, and I could even go on a little bit on that point later on.
Thank you very much, Caroline. I think that's a very critical point. This double targets of tackling migration ex post when the disaster occurs, but even doing it ex ante by doing adaptation and avoid that the root causes materialize as much as possible to keep people, as I said, safe and healthy. Let me now turn to Runa to ask you, Runa, if you can provide us with a response to what you are hearing from policymakers and the international organizations. Your organization, Friendship in the Shar Lands of Bangladesh, is at the forefront of what we have been discussing here today. Shars are islands in constant state of change and erosion. They are areas of settlement and cultivation and an important source of livelihoods for the communities you service. You have a first-hand experience of what is happening on the ground and how climate change is impacting everyday lives of the Shar dwellers. We'd like to hear from you about how the communities you work with are affected by the climate change and how this is informing their choices to migrate or not. What type of local adaptation is happening, and how do you see this as supporting communities to retain their livelihoods and indeed stay in their homes if that is what they wish to do?
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. And it's a lot of things to put together in a few minutes. So let me try to tell you a few things that is happening and is a reality of the field that I've started working in since 20 years. So migration, due to predictable climate crisis, this has been happening historically. But it is extremely different when unpredictability of unimaginable magnitude happens along with this overwhelming increase in the demography, as in the case of Bangladesh. Internal displacement, unlike inter-country migration, it's mostly silent and invisible, not very noticed. And this is the reason why I needed to start work with them and why we have been doing adaptation solutions with them since 20 years. Because, Bangladesh is, as you very rightly described, the chores, but Bangladesh is a country of 170 million people, 148,000 square kilometers, 52% already underwater, 7th on the global climate risk index, but with 1 meter rise, 1/5 of the country will be underwater, and thus it will become foremost in number of people to be impacted. And safety in migration needs to be ensured, to the people with every action that we do, so that they do not see it as a failure or a tragedy, but we give them enough tools so that they are able to restart their lives. So what is it that Friendship has been doing? We have tried to make a platform on which they can jumpstart their life. Because the country, however much the country is getting economically better and rising, these millions, it's not people in hundreds of thousands, but these are people in millions who are pulling down the economy to a level where it is not possible for the country to push further. even when you have millions, who are getting poorer every time that they are migrating, sometimes 40 times in their lifetime, sometimes 60 times in their lifetimes. With each migration, they lose homes, they lose the very land that they stand on. So how do you create a platform and make them part of the mainstream economy? And for this friendship, it went out of development notice when I started healthcare. But health is key, because when you are suffering, no other development intervention is even possible. You need to get well before you start thinking of education or empowerment or even accessing livelihood. So we built a 3-tier healthcare system, which is built on mobility, follows the community around. We take healthcare to them when they can't come to us. And this is through ship hospitals, through mobile clinics. We are serving today about direct service access to about 350,000 people in health every month. But this was not enough, because the ultra poor needs everything. So these, as migrants, are ultra poor, and sometimes poorer than people that we see who are crossing borders. But they remain under the radar, unnoticed. So we needed to give schooling. We needed to ensure they had access to agriculture, water, sanitation, giving them funding, in grant funding, whereby they can transition comfortably with knowledge and training and skills and tools, so that they can reach a level of development from which they can take off. And of course, extremely important is connectivity to the available infrastructure, government infrastructure, so that every time they migrate, they know where they stand in the ecosystems. They can demand from the government, they can demand that they are equal citizens of the country. And imbuing this is extremely important. And for this, preparedness is key and foresight is key. And it is not about assisting people. We need to humbly acknowledge that. This is part of imbuing people in a way where they will not need massive assistance. Helping them to become resilient and proud, giving their lives opportunity, dignity to make their decisions. And this is a responsibility which we all have to take. We all have to take this responsibility of them today. And each migration, it's different in each community. It needs to be micromanaged and macromanaged. We try to think that there is a panacea and everything can be managed and we have got one adaptation solution. This happens, though we keep talking about it in the conferences all the time, that locally led adaptations, etc., but actually when you're working on it, this doesn't happen. And this is, I think, something which we really, with our international partners, the UN needs to really step back and think that there is this micromanagement without which you cannot take off, and governments need to identify their own vulnerable communities. They need to address policies which are practical, compassionate, empathetical, and use them with solidarity. Because, at the end of the day, these people for whom we are all speaking, the whole COP is speaking about locally led adaptations and communities. We need to ensure that we provide everything for them so that they can build, we have to nurture their dignity and self-respect. It's the only way they can come back to the mainstream. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Runa. It was a very clear and very touching explanation of the work you do on the terrain and what you see. And it's very worrisome to hear that adaptation, in fact, is very good in COPs, but when you come to the people and to the terrain, the adaptation is quite limited, if any. We are running ahead of schedule, so I'll have one last question that I'd like to raise to the panelists. So how can international actors work together to avoid silos between efforts to support climate adaptation, prevent forced displacement, and support manageable migration? Let me start by Hanne. And can you help us to think about where the gaps are in terms of knowledge, evidence, and data, and how can we focus on filling those knowledge gaps?
Thank you very much, Vice President. Yes, I'll be brief so that in the interest of time as well. Let me start with the positive news is that there's a growing body of research in this field that seeks to really map and investigate these interlinkages. There's a growing interest also from universities and also from donors to invest in this field. And so based on the research that's already available, we can start by critically reflecting on some of the assumptions that have been made to date. For example, one that we clearly hear so far is that climate-induced migration or forced displacement will result in mass inflows to high-income countries such as the US or European states. And so we know that this will not be the case, and it's rather the focus on slow onset factors that will affect and interact with already existing migration and mobility patterns, as several of the other panelists have also referred to, but also, as you have said, this will also result in many situations in immobility because populations do not have the resources to actually move. And so that will be a really important one to look at. But if we're thinking about furthering and further developing the evidence base, there are a couple of points that we need to reflect on. Firstly, we need to be adequately aware of the different kind of scenarios that may unfold in the coming months, years, and decades. And Caroline has already referred to the Ground Slow report, making sure that we update that and really make sure that these cover the different regions of the globe will be really important. Second, also as just Runa has actually referred to, we really need to make sure that we move beyond these kind of general discussions that we're holding also today. It's an important one, but we need to become more specific, really zooming into particular context so that we can actually capture the specificities of how other factors are impacting on climate-induced migration, but also, as Runa said, making sure that then in the responses that we adapt them. And then in that respect, I think the toolbox that policymakers and program developments have at their fingertips to address the situation is still shrouded in a thick fog. We really need to unpack it. We really need to better understand it and really invest in operational research that can really investigate what works and how, and then also what actors need to be involved. It's also crucial that for the moment, a lot of this research is done in the North, but there's room for partnerships and really leadership also from the global South and in that respect. And maybe a final point, this is not only about knowledge generation, but it's also, of course, about dissemination and making sure it's available, understandable, and actionable for policymakers and for donors so that we really know what to do. And so in that respect, we need to engage with the media because we still see a lot of myths being rehearsed in the media. So we need to make sure that we engage with them, explain things properly. But also a final point is that we need to make sure that researchers can really convey their findings to policymakers. And so, for example, in Bangladesh, we see that the government is launching an action plan, and researchers from Dhaka University and the University of Exeter News have been working on this matter and are now advising them. So this is a very promising practice. So I'll end with that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Graham, let me turn to you. How do you see multilateral development bank forums contributing to unlock financing and operationalizing approaches that integrate climate, migration, and forced displacement in a holistic manner?
Well, first of all, I wanted to actually thank Runa for putting some clarity and reality into the discussion. And so it's not so theoretical, but there is a reality on the ground that needs to be addressed. I mean, climate change and migration are obviously connected, and they're connected to that broader agenda of sustainable development. If we don't address them, we're not going to achieve sustainable development. Caroline pointed out, and I think Hanne, everyone has reinforced it. I mean, the reality is that we've got slow onset impacts. We have increasing frequency of natural disasters and intensity of natural disasters. And we're going to have to address the climate elements of this. And those climate impacts are actually driving the movements of people, the displacements that relate to resource scarcity, to changes in whether or not you can actually have a livelihood in a place anymore. I think Caroline's point when she mentioned the movements of people from islands, which is already beginning. Well, there are already communities. I remember an analysis that we supported the CUNA in Panama to do on looking at exactly how are they going to manage climate change if sea level rises and basically the islands they live on, the chain is no longer inhabitable be honest. You're going to see also intra and inter-state competitions occurring with respect to food, water, and movement, the access to resources. That's going to need solutions that are regional, that cut across countries. It's not going to land only on the country itself. We also know that climate changes are going to exacerbate existing humanitarian crises, which we have our own fair share in Latin America. It's going to or people already being displaced are then going to be putting pressure on cities. We're going to see increasing problems with peripheral communities in cities that are not going to have access to services. We're already seeing these kinds of impacts occurring in Latin America and the Caribbean. And I just want to repeat that we also need to manage the just transition. I mean, the transition is beginning to occur. We're starting to see it. It is going to have implications, and it needs to be exceedingly well managed. Otherwise, as you mentioned, Ricardo, we're going to get resistances that are going to be very difficult to handle. All of this is going to actually test the capacities and limits of national governments, of subnational governments, and international cooperation. And we need new ways to respond to this. One way, as Hanne pointed out, is through policy responses. But the reality, if you look at Latin America, yes, there are some legally binding agreements, there are some policy changes, but they are very few and far between country-wise. Brazil created sort of a visa for the reception of Haitian applicants back in 2010. There are some other measures that you've seen in Argentina, Bolivia, but in reality, the policy toolbox, if you look inside, it's empty. There's a huge gap there that needs to be worked on. That's one gap, but that in itself is not going to be enough. You need new approaches, new ways of thinking, and fundamentally, like as with most of these kinds of changes, you're going to need new financing mechanisms. It does need holistic thinking. It cannot be dealt with in silos. This is a fundamental problem of sustainable development. It's been a problem for climate. Climate is not a subject. It's something that affects everything. And we've spent 10 years talking about, I've spent 10 years, but the world has been talking about this for a long time, that it's every single sector has to contribute, and they have to contribute in an integrated way. Migration is the same. And I'm tending away from using the word cross-cutting. It's central. It's the thing we need to deal with. And I think that everyone needs to be working much more towards making sure that we understand that and making sure that this is just incorporated into everything that we do. And it's really about making people's lives better and ensuring that they have good livelihoods and avoiding that anybody is getting left behind. So the MDBs should be, and I think are, very well positioned to help countries tackle these kinds of complex problems because they have a mix of technical assistance, innovative financing mechanisms that they can pilot and test, and they can use targeted concessional finance support so that they can actually move those things forward. They can help countries try and address this, and they can also help countries work with each other. They can sort of act as a sort of an honest broker to help bring together these kinds of discussions as we move forward. I also think that there's a substantial opportunity for enhancing the dialogue amongst the MDBs so that the MDBs themselves are talking to each other, that you bring them together so that they can generate innovations. So ideas from Asia can be passed to Latin America, and ideas from Latin America can be passed to Africa, and Africa so that you can actually see solutions that are being developed and see whether or not they could be transferable in a broad sense. I think there's also a value to thinking about standardizing, having a standard framework that can then be applied, particularly, for example, in policies that could be applied very specifically in specific countries. I think the agreement on how we work as MDBs in a country is also important. With climate, we've had several successes where together MDBs have worked to actually support the same initiative in a country. So that you're not siloing the support from the MDBs, but everybody's moving towards the same goal in the country. And I think that also this kind of innovation can actually generate new kinds of policy approaches, new kinds of financing approaches. So in sum, I think that the MDBs can contribute to this. Obviously, not the solution. It's the countries, the subnational governments that are going to actually deliver the solutions, the communities that are going to deliver the solutions. But the MDBs can play a very, very strong role in being able to support the kinds of changes that we need to see, and also operationalizing those changes and actually putting them on the ground. And again, just to repeat that, I think that they can play that role in innovation. They can play it as honest brokers, as conveners, and as financiers as we move forward.
Thank you very much, Graham. So, Carolyn, very quickly, what more is needed in terms of international policy coordination and action to break the silos and put all the globe working together to address this issue?
Thank you. Well, I think 3 words. We still need frames as compelling as possible. I mean, regional, international frameworks, if I can say, so that everyone goes in the same direction. So we do have the GCM for the handling, if I can say, of the migration, but we had, as a reference again, Paris Agreement. We have still to deliver in this COP, and of course next COP, much more on that, dimension of human mobility entrenched in the global framework. We need frames, we need means, and the means is now the very important, and challenging part of it. As someone said in the COP, the pot is here. If you mix, if I can say, public money and private money, the pot is here. The problem is the plumbing. So the problem is channeling the money to the people who really need it, to friendship, for instance, to the very local, to the very local level. It's just gathering the money, creating the guarantees for it, guaranteeing the risk now for the banks, so that the banks come in, regional banks, international banks, private banks, so that they can come in and accept taking this risk. And the challenge being now that we have both to finance the transition of economies to a greener economy, but as well to face the present loss and damage, the disasters, the reconstruction, and so all the expenses which have to be done for the loss and damage, or the adaptation we mentioned. And so the third aspect of it is partnership. It has been said, partnership is absolutely key at all levels. So at least inside UN, we do have a wider partnership now in what is called the United Nations Migration Network, where we have like 15 agencies which committed all to putting the human being at the center of these climate policies. We have issued a statement last week. It means that UNICEF, UNEP, IOM, UNHCR can work together on the grounds inside, a situation, a given situation. At a higher level, we need partnerships, of course, between states themselves, between states and regions, so regional and then international level, of course.
Thank you very much. Just let me give it this last minute to Runa for a message that you want to pass to policymakers, please.
Thank you. We need to work in solidarity. Bangladesh rural poor is spending $2 billion a year for the rural communities. And this is more than the government and aid agencies put together. And last year, we had 4.4 million migrants in Bangladesh. So we need hope. And hope can happen even from, today in the morning, I got this news that our students have been chosen for one of the international universities. That is hope. These are all climate migrants. So if you provide the platform, you provide the finances, hope happens. So let's build a bit on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Runa. We have to conclude. Thank you very much to all of you. I don't have any time for conclusions, but I'm sure that the listeners and all of you can take the conclusions, and we'll keep discussing and taking action to the terrain. Thank you very much to all of you.